Let me show you how to make this vegan gingerbread bundt cake. This is a lovely wintry dessert. The spices are just so comforting, has a nice warmth to it. This can be done gluten-free. So it's the exact same recipe, but just swapping out the ingredients with like gluten-free flour, gluten-free baking powder. I do have to be honest and say that the gluten-free version does dry out a little bit quicker. When it's at room temperature, it does last a couple of days before it starts drying out. But one thing about this recipe is it warms up amazingly. It kind of goes like a sponge puddingy texture. So even with the gluten-free version, after the couple of days it starts drying out, it still warms up really well. But will it be lasting a couple of days? In my house it doesn't. I got this recipe from an old boss of mine when I joined the cafe. This was only one of 2 vegan bakes that we offered, and because this was popular, I was making it pretty much every day. And then when it hit December, I was making 2 or 3 a day. We start off with a large bowl, add in the self-raising flour, baking powder, salt. I tried measuring this by hand, but as you can see, too much came out. Next up is ginger. We're only using ground ginger in this recipe. And then we have cinnamon, ground cloves and mixed spice. At this point I felt like I forgot something, and then I realised it was the tea towel. I'm doing this by hand, so I put a tea towel underneath the bowl. We want to give that a mix just so everything's distributed throughout. In a separate smaller bowl, add in the oil. I'm using sunflower oil, and then our vegan milk. Try not to spill it like I did. I'm using oat milk here, but previously I've used soy, almond and coconut. Then we add the maple syrup. The one I'm using here isn't pure maple syrup, it's a maple syrup cane sugar blend. Next is the treacle. I'm using treacle because I prefer the taste and texture it gives the cake. You can use golden syrup or a mixture between treacle and golden syrup. If you do use golden syrup, I would suggest adding in 2 tablespoons of dark brown sugar. I hate this part because it's so messy, but I've seen Marks and Spencer's do a squeezy treacle, so I might try that next time. Next is to zest the orange. This grater wasn't working so well, so I switched to a box grater, which again wasn't much better. I'm going to buy a microplane or something similar. They work so much better. We give that a good mix. It should go thick and dark coloured. Now it's time to add the wet liquids to the dry ingredients. Make a well in the centre of the flour. I'm sure you'll do a much better job than I did here. Pour the ingredients into the well and whisk that all together. I like to use a whisk just because it reduces the chance of lumps. We don't want to see any more streaks of flour, but be careful to not overmix. This next step, it is a little bit tricky. We need a carbonated drink. I'm using San Pellegrino, or this might be the Aldi knockoff, I'm not sure. You don't have to use this, you can really use any fizzy drink. So I've used cola, ginger beer, as long as it's carbonated, as long as it's fizzy. I'm just using an orange flavoured one because it goes with the orange zest that I added. The reason why we want this to be fizzy is because we're going to add bicarb to it. It's kind of like when you add Mentos to Coke, how it kind of fizz up. It's not to that extent, and this process is going to incorporate air and lightness into the cake. It's what makes the sponge really nice and soft. It's a bit like with red velvet cake when you mix bicarb and vinegar and then pour that in, but we're just using more liquid. We want to keep this as fizzy as possible. I'm trying to slowly pour it against the side of the jug. I find this way better of keeping that fizz, keeping the carbonation instead of just pouring it all in. Then add in the bicarbonate of soda. So this next step, we do have to be quite quick because we want to retain as much of that fizz as possible. You need to pour the drink and stir the mix at the same time. This would be a lot easier to do in a mixer. However, when I can, I like to bake by hand. I find it more relaxing, but I'm also aware not everyone has access to a mixer. So I like to show that these aren't always necessary and recipes can be done by hand. When the drink is fully added, I like to get a spatula and just scrape the bottoms of the bowl. Pour the mixture into a greased bundt tin. I like this one because it spreads out by itself. Bake at 180 degrees for about 45 to 50 minutes. When it's done, it should be soft and slightly springy to the touch, and a toothpick comes out clean. Leave to cool slightly. I have to be a little bit quiet because it's quite late. This cake is best the next day, so I'm doing it in the evening. Ideally, I would have done it earlier, but I was craving gingerbread, so I've let this cool most of the way. It's still got a little bit of warmth at the bottom. I don't like to let this one cool completely because it can get stuck around the edges. I know some people like to get bunts out after about 20 minutes, half an hour, but because this one's so soft. If you get it out too early, it kind of buckles under its own weight and just flattens out a bit. I've waited about an hour, hour and a half. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to run a palette knife around the edges and in the middle as well. Preferably you would be using a large palette knife on the outside and a small palette knife in the middle. I can't find my large palette knife now, so I'm just going to use the small one for both. For the middle part, ideally you would be sticking in the palette knife and then running it around in one smooth motion, but for some reason here I'm doing a seesaw motion. And then for the outside, I like to do a seesaw motion because it gets right to the bottom. I'm going to be turning it out onto this turntable. I'm going to be putting an orange drizzle on the Bundt, so it just saves transferring it onto a plate and then onto here. But I'm not going to flip it directly onto here. I like to put greaseproof on whatever I'm going to flip it on. If it doesn't come out the first time once you flip it, you can go around again with the palette knife. Another thing I find that helps is lifting it up slightly then dropping it. But obviously only do this if it's safe, if the tin can take it, if whatever you're dropping on can take it. Pull out the tin and this is what the tin looks like. And that is totally normal, it's totally fine. Again with the palette knife, it looks quite wet. That's totally normal. I mean, I quite like it because I can just scrape it down and eat it, and it's this like nice gooey bits of gingery goodness. Sometimes it doesn't happen, sometimes it does. It's totally fine. As long as it's not like clumps of it sticking to the pan, I'm happy. Now it's the next day and the cake has completely cooled. I'm going to be putting a drizzle on this. The drizzle I'm going to do is an icing sugar orange juice drizzle. I just want to use up the juice that's left in this orange. However, you don't have to do a drizzle. You can put something else on top. Or if you are wanting to do an icing sugar drizzle, it doesn't have to be orange. It can be cinnamon. I really like a rum drizzle. I normally don't measure this. I just do it by eye. It's hard to give an exact amount because it's going to be different every time. It depends on what icing sugar you use, what orange you use. I'm going to weigh it today because do it by eye is not the most helpful. And then I'm just going to spoon that on. Hopefully it will look nice. So start off with the icing sugar in a bowl. In total I used 200 grams. Then we add the orange juice. I started off with 2 tablespoons. In total I used 60 mils. It's important to add a small amount of liquid at first and then gradually add in a little by little. There have been many times where I've misjudged and added in too much liquid, and then I have to add in more icing sugar, and then I'm left with twice as much as I need. You can add in, but you can't take out. This is the consistency I like. It's thick, but still has a bit of movement to it. We want gravity to assist us with getting the drips down the sides of the cake. It needs to be thick enough so it can hold itself, but then thin enough so it can spread a little bit. I'm getting a big spoonful, probably just over a tablespoon's worth, and I'm doing this in quarters. So I spread the blob of icing over that quarter and then gently try and push it towards the edges. Honestly, I do struggle with trying to make it look neat. I like to push a little bit of the icing towards the middle because I don't like it naked in the middle. However, pretty much every time I end up pushing too much to the middle and there's a giant blob of icing in the middle. And then with whatever's left in the bowl, I fill in gaps. I do swoops of icing around the edge just to make sure there's drops dripping down the side. And then that goes in the fridge to set. Keep in mind it might continue dripping slowly while it's in the fridge. The cake's been in the fridge for about a couple of hours now. The icing has pretty much set. It's quite hard now. Another reason why I like to put this on greaseproof paper is because the icing that falls into the middle is a lot easier to clean up. So now I'm just going to put it onto this cake board. Now's the final moment. This cake is a little bit robust, but it is soft, so be careful when lifting it. So here you go. Here is the vegan and gluten-free gingerbread Bundt cake. The perfect dessert for winter.